Hello, and welcome to Hempfest Symposium. This is our panel on marijuana and the media. I want to first introduce our panelists. We have some tremendous people on the panel today, and of course our moderator is Steve Bloom. I'm going to go through our panelists first. We have Angela Bacca. Angela is a Southern California-based freelance journalist, writer, author, and editor. She got her start in cannabis media as a student journalist, that too, at San Francisco State University in 2007, and became the editorial assistant to Ed Rosenthal. Tauhid Chappell is an 8-year veteran of the media industry with a resume that includes stints at the Washington Post and the Philadelphia Inquirer. Tauhid is also an executive board member and parliamentarian of the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists, the oldest association of Black journalists in the country, and the chapter responsible for founding the National Association of Black Journalists. Next up, we have Kymone Freeman. Kymone is an artist, activist, and co-founder of We Act Radio, Washington, D.C.'s independent progressive radio and TV studio. Most recently, in memory of slain community journalists, We Act Radio established the Charnice Milton Community Bookstore. Vanessa Maria Graber is a community organizer, media personality, and educator from Philadelphia. She's currently the News Voices at New Jersey manager at Free Press, where she works with journalists and community leaders on meeting the public's information needs during the pandemic. Most recently, she was the station manager and co-founder of the community radio station WPPM-FM at Philly Cam, where she still hosts several radio TV programs, including the People Power Lunch Hour, a program featuring organizers with local social movements, and East Coast Cannabis Radio, a program about cannabis culture and drug policy. Vanessa has over 20 years experience in media and grassroots campaigns. She's worked on media justice issues, such as the largest U.S. expansion of community radio, reforming net neutrality rules, and advocating for public access TV. In addition to media policy, Vanessa's been organizing locally for drug policy reform, including working to pass the cannabis decrim law in Philadelphia, advocating for Senate Bill 7 for medical cannabis in Pennsylvania, organizing to expand the medical cannabis program in New Jersey, and coordinating events in support of cannabis legalization in Philly and New Jersey. She currently works with the Coalition of People of Color in Philadelphia to legalize cannabis in Pennsylvania and repair the damage done to communities of color by the drug war. And last but certainly not least, I bring up our moderator for this panel, and that is Steve Bloom. Steve is one of my very best friends. Steve is a longtime journalist and author with 32 years in the cannabis community. His credits include editor-in-chief of 2 Centennial Media titles, Marijuana Goes Mainstream and The Complete Guide to CBD, publisher of CelebStoner.com, one of the leading sources of marijuana and celebrity news on the web since 2007.
Thank you, Doug, for that terrific introduction. I'm flattered. I'm very excited to be here today, to be part of the Seattle Hempfest that is not taking place live. Normally takes place in August. Beautiful location along the Puget Sound up in Seattle.
So I've been pretty busy. I also joined the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, and my brother from another mother, Tauhid, is working on his end with PABJ, and we're trying to shift coverage on a number of different things. Of course, Latinos have their own set of needs. We would like more Spanish language information. And when it comes to like the Spanish language media, like Telemundo, Univision, and how they cover cannabis, there's still a lot of work to be done. And if you look at the state level on a public health communications perspective, Latinos still can't really access medical marijuana in Pennsylvania. And so there's a lot of outreach and communication that needs to be done to be able to get the information to my community. The way that all this stuff intersects is like, at a very basic level, like access to communication, information is a human right. We need information that's accurate, that's reflective of our communities to be able to be more engaged and active, right? And hopefully people who are more informed and civically engaged can contribute to their own liberation. So that's why I do the work that I do. I have to consume a lot of cannabis in order to deal with all of this. So it has definitely both fueled my advocacy and helped treat my anxiety. But, you know, never a boring day here in Philadelphia on the front lines. And so I will keep you posted. You can follow me at NewsDrawn or on Facebook, as you said, and see my daily dispatches and rants about all things happening in Philly.
Well, one follow-up question for you. Anything to say to our president who had that comment recently about bad things happen in Philadelphia?
Well, bad things happen in the White House too, apparently, and on Air Force One. Yeah. You know, I would actually, people in Philly said, yeah, it's true, right? Like we have, they're the biggest poor city in the country. We have a rising rate of gun violence. We have schools that are falling apart and underfunded. We have roads and dilapidated homes that need repaired. You know, our federal funding continues to be cut for vital social programs. Yes, bad things are happening as a result of your bad policies and the way that you have disavowed people of color and poor and working people. So we need to do something about that. It's what he's saying is not true, but good things happen in Philadelphia too, because people are fighting back, they're organizing, they're informing themselves, they're mobilizing people.
Thanks for that. Tauhid, you live in Philadelphia as well?
I technically now live in South Jersey outside of Philadelphia, but my work for Free Press with my colleague Vanessa is focused and emphasized in Philadelphia. I used to live in Philadelphia for 2 years.
Would you like to weigh in on that question about Trump's comment?
Oh, well, first and foremost, thank you for having me be a part of this. And I'm just, happy to be on this prestigious panel with so many people, including a person like Vanessa, who I consider a mentor of mine. So to even share this space with her is a huge honor. But, in terms of comments on Trump, like, he says what he says just to get people stirred up. We have bigger issues that we need to focus on. So for him to call out Philadelphia is nothing new. We kind of have an understanding of what Philly feels like against Trump. So, for me to see that comment, it is what it is. You see a whole lot of T-shirts happening, which is, expected to see people really rally around the Philadelphia pride. But, I'm not too worried about his emphasis on our city. We have a whole lot of things that we need to focus on. So if people want to help out with all the issues that Vanessa brought up with Philly, we can certainly use that support. So I'm glad he said it out, because now people are looking at Philly, and hopefully some of the resources will come to our communities.
Okay, so fill me in on what have you been up to over the last 6 months, and what kind of work are you doing right now?
Yeah, so like Vanessa, I also joined Free Press, which is a media policy and media advocacy organization. My focus specifically is on a long-term project in Philadelphia, focused on basically transforming and reimagining how journalists cover crime, police, public safety, and the criminal legal system. And it's a twofold type of project. It's one, working with journalists to make sure that they are centering and elevating the perspectives and expertise of people impacted by policing in the criminal legal system, mostly Black and Brown and disproportionately Black and Brown communities, and also working with community organizers, community activists, and community members to feel empowered to tell their stories, tell their narratives, and get the information that is vital for them to understand and navigate these complex systems that are very suppressive and oppressive. And as we know, historically, media has never been reflective of these communities. So we are building an information structure and information tree that really accurately and adequately addresses this information when the local news media ecosystem isn't doing a sufficient job in informing us. So it's a really cool project. It's a really good way to really think about the shortfalls that local media and commercial media typically has, in trying to find best ways to keep us all informed so that we can be more civically and politically engaged to transform these institutions. So I've been busy working on that front in Philadelphia. I also just launched this past Saturday the Can-Atlantic Conference, which was referenced, which was the country's first Mid-Atlantic cannabis conference, virtually, focused on equity, media, and policy for those who were inside and outside and just interested in the cannabis space. So that was a long-term project that I had been working on since last year. We were supposed to launch in April of this year. Obviously, COVID threw a wrench in that, so we pushed that into a digital format later in September, and we finally launched. So if you're interested in learning about the Mid-Atlantic cannabis markets, check out Can Atlantic Conference. We had an awesome amount of different organizers and organizations on the ground in the region talking about their state of state cannabis markets and what legalization might look like moving forward. And we know that New Jersey is going to legalize, or most likely will legalize in November. What does that mean for the rest of the region? How is that domino effect going to impact this region that has a lot of Black and brown communities? And specifically with a city like Philadelphia, which is a 44% Black population, and a city like Vanessa mentioned has a 25% poverty rate, what does legalization mean in Pennsylvania, and how can that potentially impact our communities here? So that just got launched off the ground, and I'm very excited to continue that conversation too. I'm also a cannabis patient. I suffer from an autoimmune deficiency disorder called ulcerative colitis. And for those who might have not heard about that, but may know or have heard of Crohn's disease, it's within that similar family. So it's been really scary. It's been really scary for me to see this pandemic just go out of control and have our leadership at all levels fail in addressing and adequately addressing these issues.
The direction that we're advocating for, right? Like there is a thing called movement journalism, right? Where it is journalism and media that is kind of an extension or wing of a movement, right? In trying to advocate for change. But I also think that within existing and traditional newsrooms, we need to break away from this idea of activist journalism and move in the direction of verification, transparency in your own biases, and seeking the truth no matter what the cost.
Terrific answer. Thank you so much. So, Kymone, can you weigh in on this? What is the role of activism in media?
Well, first, I wanted to say that Fox News is the largest news organization in America, and they have zero objectivity. And when they was in Australia, I believe, there was actually described as being a cancer to democracy. I just want to put that out there because that is where we are. The best way I can answer your question is to point to here in DC, there was a 1,000 square foot art installation depicting suffragist and civil rights advocate Ida B. Wells for the 19th Amendment anniversary. It was a portrait, it was a collage portrait over 5,000 historic Black and white photographs from women from the suffrage movement. And that is, if you report that, that is accurate. All of that is true. But that also leaves out the fact that Ida B. Wells was a journalist who spoke out against lynching. That was her raison d'etre. And to this day, America has no federal laws against lynching. Okay, they have it against destroying a statue, but not for destroying Black bodies. And she went on to say, and this quote sits on the front door of WEAC Radio studio. She says that those that commit the murders write the reports. Now that all of that is left out in her being honored as part of the women's suffragist movement. So when WEAC Radio reported, we made sure that we mentioned all of that. So what my point is, even when they get the story right, the omission and what they're not saying is just as important as what has been said. And I think that it is imperative that we, as independent, if we're going to be independent, we should be outside the box. I loved your publication, and they had so many great articles came out of that would never been printed in mainstream publications. And I'm sure there's been times where they might have picked up on a story that you guys broke first. I know here in DC, many NPR, WAMU, Washington Post even, will mine smaller outlets for information and news stories that they otherwise would never have picked up on. If it gets a little traction, it makes a little noise, they pick it up, and I could point to several instances of that happening. I make no apologies about being an activist journalist. I think it's imperative. I think it's the times that we're living in. And if we, I don't think there's good people on both sides. I don't care that Trump line of reasoning. You know what I'm saying? So I don't even waste my time with trying to humanize or sympathize or empathize with the opposition. It's like, well, you got to have it so that a Republican's point of view is made. I don't care about, it's 2 points. It's a right one and a wrong one. And I like to think that we're on the right side of history. And I think that if Fox News is the #1 news agency in this country, then we need to do what we can to offset that.
Thanks a lot. Angela, do you consider yourself an activist journalist?
I don't know how I could not consider myself an activist journalist because of the way I came into the industry. I think or into the media generally, the first articles I was writing were activist pieces about mothers getting their children taken away for their cannabis use, and with a clear appeal at the end that says, if you want to help, here's how you help. But to echo what Vanessa and Kymone just said, I don't think it's possible at all for there ever to not be a bias when covering cannabis, because you're either giving equal weight to people's opinions or you're going to go with the facts. And the facts aren't commonly accepted by the majority of people just yet. So we have a lot of that to combat when you're covering cannabis in particular. But I also think we need to get away from this idea that there is such a thing as non-biased media, period. There just is not. We're all humans. We're the ones who report it. And I think that as a journalist myself, I can have my activist bent. I can have my own opinions. But if I'm citing my sources for the facts that I'm claiming to have, and I'm clearly disclosing my biases by giving you those opinions up front, to me, that's almost more honest of a reporting style than to pretend that I have no bias in this and give equal weight to people's opinions. If you're a really good journalist and you did your research, you will have an opinion about what you're working on.
Thanks a lot. So I want to steer towards the next question. We only have that much time left, but this one could eat up the rest of our allotted time. So directed at Tauhid, who founded the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists. And so I want to zero in on diversity in cannabis as far as the media is concerned. Where are we in that place? Is there enough work for people of color, or are people of color being left behind?
Thanks, Steve, for that question. One slight correction. I'm an executive board member. PABJ was founded in 1973, I believe. So I was not a founder, but I would have loved to have been there in that room when it created. But I carry that legacy of working to ensure that there is more diversity and equity and inclusion in the media space. But to answer your point, no, there is absolutely not enough diversity. There is not enough representation. And frankly, in commercial media and nonprofit media, there will never be diversity of the proportions that it needs to be at, because the way that commercial media is structured is inherently suppressing and oppressing and censoring journalists of color who work in that industry and work in that sector. It's very hard. I've worked 4 years in local TV, 2 years in Phoenix, 2 years in Sacramento. I worked at the Washington Post. I've worked at the Philadelphia Inquirer. So 2 different newspapers. I've worked in 2 different types of sectors of the media industry, and it gets no better. It's not easy for Black journalists and journalists of color to talk about their ideas, raise issues that come from their communities and their networks, because inherently the structure is very white-centered. It's very much focused on white issues, and the people who are in charge with determining the newsworthiness of what the media or what the public gets to see and consume are inherently white, and they do not really value or understand or really appreciate the complexities, the context and the nuance that affect and impact communities of color. And so we have a long ways to go. I mean, there are surveys, there are reports out there to show that there is consistent failure of representation in mainstream media. And that's why you do see, and that's why there has always historically have been newspapers and other media that have been created by Black people, by communities of color, because they feel left out. They don't feel reflected. They don't feel represented within the media ecosystem. And that is so true. I've experienced it for almost 10 years working within newspapers and TV, that there's a pipeline issue. There's a retention issue. There's a equity and payment issue. There's all sorts of issues that really inhibit commercial media from actually transforming and being reflective of the communities that it should be covering. And I have to mention this because I mentioned this to everybody, is that I think the Census Bureau predicted by 2050, there's gonna be more people of color than white people. And that's going to have to be there's gonna have to be a fundamental shift in power dynamics and power structures and structures of this entire industry if we're actually gonna be truly reflective of the changing demographics of our country. And that has historically never been the case. And, for me, I see that the increase of work that we see from people who are working as, independent journalists, or sometimes called freelance journalists, or independent contractors, we're seeing a larger creation of that, because people are understanding that these newsrooms are toxic places. These newsrooms make it very difficult for us to work in, because we have to go through all these microaggressions, racism, all these types of dismissals about what we know is the truth about our communities, but we know is not being reported within these institutions. So there's going to be, in my opinion, especially given the fact that the pandemic has continued to shrink the industry as we see it, we're going to see a lot more people just venturing out on their own, creating new ecosystems, creating new information trees, and really addressing and providing better alternatives to what we're seeing right now in the mainstream sector.
Thanks a lot for that. Vanessa, where can people of color, where can they turn to in the media to find coverage of for people of color? Where's the vibe for cannabis?
Well, of course, community radio, right? Like that's where my heart is. When I started WPPM, I was like, we need shows about cannabis, the drug war, drug policy. So of course I put Century of Lies on there, and Cultural Baggage, the Drug Truth Network. We had our own show. I think community radio has been one of the longest standing places that have invited discussion, conversation about cannabis, right, and the drug war, and been able to have long conversations. When I had my office at WPPM, I always had the radio on, and I always appreciated the coverage from the conferences, because those were conferences I couldn't afford, right, or couldn't travel to, right? So being able to record those sessions, talk to the experts, and learn, I learned so much just by listening to those shows. So, and I'm not just, kissing butt here. Shout out to KMUD, right, KMUD, in Northern California, which is another station. Sometimes they call it KBUD. Because they have a whole marijuana news report, and I remember they would let people know on the radio if the police were around or the feds were around doing raids, and they were really vital resource during the wildfires. So like I said, community radio stations, public access TV, also they've all had people locally contribute content around those issues. KBOO in Portland as well has been another great station. So I could go on, but that's my shout out to community media. There's a lot of really great podcasts too. The podcast scene is emerging, and you can find a number of really great POC podcasts. And my former co-host, Flip Marley, started a whole venture called Black Cannabis. That's a multimedia platform. In Philly, we had Black Cannabis Week, right, which is information and education in the form of a digital space of organizing and workshops. So I'm always been an audio visual person. There's a lot of really great individuals, I would say, that work for publications that do online stuff. We haven't really seen a mainstream High Times magazine or media outlet geared towards people of color, but certainly the information is out there. If you look for podcasts on iTunes or sites like Spotify, you'll find a myriad of producers, but also check out the Drug Truth Network for some really basic information. And I hope that people will continue creating content, right, at the local level, at the national level. But we're still not really there. When I look for Spanish language sources, I'm always finding things produced in other countries, right? From Mexico and Colombia, there's been a lot of really great media and publications. Puerto Rico now has a cannabis scene with medical marijuana. And there's going to be a conference in December that we're putting on in collaboration, or it's being led by the Minority Cannabis Business Administration, which is the Asamblea Internacional Canábica, which is International Cannabis Assembly. So one of the things that we're trying to do is find more media, who are they? Let's aggregate them. Let's try to put them all on one page as a resource, and let's form a network so we can work together.
Well, there you have it. So we're going to wrap this up. It was a terrific panel. I want to thank Vanessa Maria, Angela Bacca, Kymone Freeman, and Tauhid Chappell, and of course, Doug McVay for producing this panel and bringing us all together today. Let's hear it for Hempfest, Seattle Hempfest, and let's hope for another 20 years of Hempfest. Thanks for having us today. Appreciate it.